The following is an official lore video of the Dark Diaspora Universe, a journey in world-building project.
By the time we saw it, it was too late. If the Fates had decreed its arrival even 50 years earlier, during an era of comparative prosperity and enlightenment, we may have been forewarned of our impending doom. Yet, over 3 decades of global war had utterly destroyed our capacity to gaze out into the solar system and beyond. And so it was, on March 3rd, 2096, only a decade after global nuclear exchange ended the War of Cataclysm, that Earth was impacted by an extinction-level event. What biosphere that had survived the nuclear apocalypse was crushed beneath the existential weight of enveloping fire and oppressive darkness. Humanity was already a shell of its former glory, desperately clinging to the last vestiges of life. For most, the meteor's impact rang out as the final death knell. Many now view the Madagascar impact as the righteous fury of a scorned creator, wiping clean their mistake. Others raise the event up as clear evidence of the inherent cruelty of an unforgiving universe. Yet, against all odds, some survived. Small communities that had escaped the fallout of war in underground warrens of tunnels and bunkers proved the best place to weather the long, cold night of the impact. Life in the warrens was its own cruel form of punishment, with deprivation and starvation rampant. The alternative, though, was certain death on the surface. By the time the skies cleared of the dust and debris of impact, the remnants of humanity emerged, haggard but alive, from subterranean strongholds in Finland, the Australian outback, the Canadian Rockies, Mongolia, Ethiopia, and Chile. Yet, the surface world they inherited was little more than a broken and irradiated husk, a wasteland of stone, ice, and desert, wholly unfit for human habitation. If humanity was to survive, it would not be on Earth. The only hope for a desperate and dying species was to reach out to the stars to find a new home. For while the war and impact had destroyed civilization, military research had afforded the orphans of humanity the key to escape the confines of our now dead home world, faster than light travel. The remnants of humanity coalesced into a single entity, the United Recovery Authority, and soon the survivors congregated in northern Australia. Here, the remaining mineral and energy bounty of the Australian continent was put to work, extracted and invested into the grand project of survival. New technologies saw orbital launch capacity develop rapidly, and a large construct, known as Bridgehead Station, was assembled in geosynchronous orbit. It was from Bridgehead Station that we cast ourselves out into the deep dark of the universe in earnest. Yet, in our desperation to flee, we were blind to the abject horrors of the galaxy. And now, half a millennia later, we continue to pay the ultimate price for the hubris of ignoring one simple and undeniable truth. Humanity was never destined for the stars. We were meant to die on Earth. War, despite endless suffering and needless violence, has always bequeathed to humanity innovative and novel technologies. Our history is littered with advancements, conceived in the fires of conflict, that have transformed society or underpinned decades of prosperity. So it is far from hyperbole to claim that, without the discovery of anti-gravity fields during the dying embers of the War of Cataclysm, our desperate gambit of escape and survival would have failed. The discovery of anti-gravity fields proved instrumental in the early work of the United Recovery Authority. On Earth, anti-gravity excavators extracted and hauled the millions of tons of resources required to fuel the foundries of industry. Anti-gravity transports rescued the survivors of Earth effortlessly gliding across the broken and devastated terrain of the world. Hundreds of anti-gravity boosters were launched daily, rising smoothly into the air and space beyond, as if by magic, ferrying components and later workers and colonists to Bridgehead Station. Yet, it was the role of the anti-gravity drives in spaceflight that proved decisive to humanity's scattering among the stars. At first, rudimentary drives were jerry-rigged to makeshift orbital craft by the trade lanes of Old Sol, bouncing between Bridgehead Station, helium-3 mines on the moon, and heavy metal operations in the asteroid belt. But while this interplanetary fight opened up the solar system to humanity, the stars remained out of reach. That required faster-than-light travel. To draw on the power required to disperse the survivors among the stars, humanity found the solution in the seething and churning energies latent in the vacuum of space itself. Momentary realization and compression of this zero-point energy, or ZPE, proved an effective proxy for a singularity-level gravity well, and soon ZPE-powered anti-gravity drives were being tested for interstellar flight. With hope filling the artificial air of Bridgehead Station for the first time since before, hundreds of thousands of survivors were ferried from the surface for the last time and loaded into small colonization craft, known to passengers and to history as scatterpods. These pods, metallic gray and cylindrical, were far from the grand space-faring vessels of science fiction, but what they lacked in finesse, they made up for in mass production. Thousands of pods were constructed, each with their own anti-gravity drive, capable of carrying 500 men, women, and children, along with provisions, frozen embryos, seeds, and equipment across the stars. The risks of launch were great and failures were common, but humanity had come too far to stop. Those lost were simply added to the collective grief of humanity, unnamed and faceless martyrs whose sacrifice was mourned, but then soon forgotten. And so, only half a century after the formation of the United Recovery Authority, the scattering began, with the weight of hope for a better future for humanity resting on its shoulders. Yet, we know now that the dispersal of the orphans of Earth that laid the foundation for a diaspora was not our salvation. That we simply traded a dead homeworld for the pain, suffering, and terror of a cruel universe. We dared not wait. In our desperation to escape the ruined husk of our homeworld, the novel technologies upon which we depended were subject to only rudimentary testing before being deployed. That proved our folly. The first ZPE-powered anti-gravity drive tests proved their practical application, hurling the makeshift test craft between Earth, Jupiter, and back. The test ship proved surprisingly resilient to the stresses of FTL, while the crew seemed no worse for the trip, exhibiting only minor ailments. So, seeking to leverage the sudden burgeoning of hope that filled the artificial air of Bridgehead Station, the URA launched the first wave of the scatterpods. A total of 1,200 pods were dispersed across our galactic quadrant to prospective habitable planets and moons, in the hope of seeding human life across the universe. With bated breath, we waited for the return of the comm beacons to herald the safe arrival of the scatterpods. Yet, hours gave way to days, and soon the scale of the calamity became apparent. None of the pods had survived. It was then that we discovered the Malady. Shortly after the catastrophic failure of the first colonization wave, the crew of the original test ship began to present with medical complications. At first, it was anxiety, mild, then intense. This was followed by hallucinations, psychotic breaks, and eventually, pure, horror-fueled aggression and rage. All attempts at treatment failed, and within 6 months, the entire test ship crew of 72 were dead. For the human mind was never meant to travel faster than light. with consciousness proving entirely incompatible with the universe outside of space and time. While the crew had only been in FTL for just 90 seconds during their round trip to Jupiter, the passengers in the first wave of scatterpods were outside of real space for hours, even days. We now know that those first colonists ripped each other apart with their bare hands the moment they returned to real space. The pods now filled with mangled corpses and viscous pools of blood and ichor. We attempted to learn from our mistakes, with subsequent waves afforded to a modicum of protection from the malady through a cocktail of drugs referred to as the fog, which we continue to use to this day. Yet this has proven only a partial solution, and even now, reports are regularly received by the major powers of cases of the malady, random people violently attacking their fellow passengers and crew. The reports, however, are dismissed by cold politicians and ignored by a numb populace, rationalized as the cruel price humanity must pay to keep Diaspora functioning. But we will forever be reminded of our hubris by those original scatterpods, still out there, drifting in the black void. Almost all now float through space as lifeless tombs, silent reliquaries of our never-ending torment and regret. Yet, there are tales among privateers, traders, and outposts that claim not all the scatterpods are in fact as lifeless as they may appear, and that to open one is to beckon forth death itself. The Diaspora has no king, no emperor, no president. There is no single government or authority that rules over all of humanity. No universal laws, no common tongue. Instead, the Diaspora is simply the name for a region of space some 10,000 light-years across, encompassing almost 400,000 stars. This is the extent of the scattering, where the remnants of the human species were dispersed over half a millennia ago. All who survived, who fled from a lost Earth, now call the Diaspora home, struggling to persevere in a seemingly malevolent existence. The vast majority of humanity now desperately cling to the surface of barren worlds or blighted moons, forever at the edge of calamity and demise. And at the very center of the Diaspora, surrounded by the sphere of human influence in the galaxy, is Old Sol. Small outposts, communities, settlements, and colonies count in the thousands, seeded by the original scatterpods. Yet, the isolation of most of the settlements is almost absolute, the residents of which may never see a ship or pod from the wider Diaspora during their lifetimes. The only institutions that could claim an element of ubiquity in the Diaspora are the merchants of the Coalition, or perhaps the proselytizing deacons of the Tarvan Covenant. Home in the Diaspora is limited to artificial environs and a small number of marginally habitable planets. Planets such as Kanara, Janfar, and Dancer's Leap are little more than global deserts, irradiated by the energized rays of volatile young stars and stripped of their precious moisture. Anners, Vicinity, and Galador are giant ice worlds where biting cold and grasping gravity seek to bring the local populace to their knees. Water worlds such as Ozovan and Retreat inflict upon their human residents the constant threat of deluge, flood, and inundation, be it by global storm or errant tsunami. Even those planets with life, like Korix and Samayaji, have birthed horrors unlike anything in the long history of life on Earth. Dense carnivorous jungles or rampantly enveloping slime threaten wayward individuals and entire settlements alike. Life in the Diaspora is defined by a never-ending grinding battle against unimaginable horrors and inconceivable dreads. And yet, despite all this, humanity lingers. Treaties of all manner and kind have been signed by representatives of settled systems, while more tangible and practical commitments loosely hold together hundreds of smaller settlements in the bonds of mutual assistance. Yet, such treaties and bonds are rarely honored, though not out of contempt or disregard for obligations. For the harsh reality of the diaspora is that one's own survival, one's very existence in the universe, must always be the utmost priority. And whatever sense of fraternity exists in the diaspora is embodied only in a shared hope for mutual survival, that we can all repel for another day the countless nightmares made real by a barbarous universe. Despite the terror, strife, and deprivation of the diaspora, humanity still longs for prosperity. Yet, when the shadow of a merchant ship appears in the skies above a colony, its residents cannot help but be overcome by an uneasy mix of hope and dread. Such is the ominous reputation of the merchants of the Coalition, tracing their origins back centuries to the settlement of the Kanara system. This guild of merchants and privateers found initial success within the Tyson Sector Compact, the largest multi-planetary federation in the diaspora. The central role of the guild in the development of the compact, coupled with a general lack of stringent regulations and consumer protections at the time, enabled early coalition merchants and administrators to grow fat on seemingly limitless profits. Nowadays, lucrative cargo and passenger charters, anti-piracy and bounty hunting contracts, and even clandestine security operations are now all services of a merchant's offering. And the Byzantine bureaucracy of the administrators has proven so ubiquitous that the Coalition's own credit system, C-Credits, has been informally adopted as the diaspora's universal trade currency. Despite this power and pervasiveness, the Coalition does not hold a monopoly on interstellar commerce. Other smaller trading houses hold sway over tiny pockets of the diaspora, while non-aligned, independent merchants, derisively called free flaggers, are a common sight throughout the deep, dark reaches of space. With the conditions of even the most prosperous settlements barely rising to the level of subsistence, many desperate and disenchanted residents look longingly to the stars for the opportunity to escape. Equipped with little more than a decommissioned pod, few free flaggers ever leave the comparative safety of their own system. The most successful, however, almost always parlay their initial earnings into a ZPE manifold and fog implants, opening up the path to the stars, and with it, potential riches. But without the steady contracts and reliable charters made available to memberships of the Coalition, most free flaggers struggle to survive. Many succumb, in a moment of weakness and desperation, to the temptation of Coalition membership, trading away their hard-fought freedom for notional security. Even this is rarely sufficient to stave off the constant threat of bankruptcy, or worse still, catastrophic systems failure in an isolated and hostile system. And for those free flaggers that do strike it big, such success is typically fleeting. For when a profitable deal or trade route is uncovered by Coalition operatives, predatory pricing and well-placed bribes see the free flagger quickly squeezed out by fleets of unscrupulous Coalition merchants. This renders the majority of smaller settlements of the diaspora utterly dependent on the whims of the Coalition merchants for their very survival. Without any real substantive competition, the price of the dependence is steep. Bribes and corruption are regarded as standard business practice, while price gouging is actively encouraged by the Coalition codes of conduct. Even the rampant assaults on property destruction on settlements by drunken Coalition crews is begrudgingly accepted by local leaders as the price of doing business. For there is little choice for most colonies but to tolerate, through the gritted teeth of seething resentment, whatever ill treatment is inflicted upon them. For without the patronage of the Coalition merchants and privateers, almost all settlements of humanity would quickly fall, unable to stand alone and isolated against the unrelenting horrors of a cruel and unforgiving universe. Life in the diaspora is defined by a ceaseless battle between the grinding terrors of a malevolent universe and the sheer will of an unrelenting people to survive. So when the horrors that plague the residents of the diaspora become too much to bear, many seek to buttress their souls with a fervent devotion to something greater, the faith of the Tarvan convent. Born from the broken and burning moon of the galactic southeast of Old Sol, the landscape of this barren rocky world is dominated by steep cliffs of gray and black slate, ripped apart by deep ravines and crevices of magma and fire. Dense choking plumes of smoke fill the air, combining with the ominous specter of Tarvan's gas giant, called the Herald, to cast the moon in a constant twilight. Here, along the edges of the ravines, do the deacons and novices of the Covenant meditate and pray for the sins of humanity, that we may be excused for blighting the universe with our unclean presence, and forgiven for the original sin of the destruction of our homeworld. Yet, all in the Covenant know that to save humanity and the souls of the people, the devout must cast themselves out into the stars and spread the word of the one true religion. Fleets of ships travel to and from Tarvan from across the diaspora each day, bringing pilgrims and converts, voluntary or forced, to the broken moon, while transporting the proselytizing novices and newly stationed deacons into the black void. With most settlements isolated and alone, the guarded suspicion that initially meets the appearance of the dull gray cloaks of the Covenant novices more often than not gives way to a wailing acceptance of the people of their sins and a newfound hope for tomorrow. Here, the novices take their central place in the local community, shepherding the people away from sin and the mistakes and fortifying their souls for a price against the hardship of existence. Yet, not all are honorable in their intent and actions. Corruption among the Covenant is widespread, and writs of universal indulgence and backroom deals with local power brokers are common. Similarly, not all settlements are welcoming of the Covenant's faith, casting aside the one true religion in favor of local cults and holy men, or for a meaningless existence free of the glory of spirituality. In the face of such corruption and rejection, there are those of the Covenant who walk a different path. Those deacons and novices whose souls burn red from the fires of righteous fervor recognize that mortal notions of choice and free will are simply tools of malevolent forces seeking to hasten the fall of humanity. And so when the crimson and silver ships of the Covenant's red order descend from the skies above a wayward settlement, it is not to shepherd the misguided residents back to the truth. Instead, the Covenant wields the great weapons that are fear, pain, and torture to break the bodies of the apostates so that their minds and souls may be freed. And for the unlucky few that survive this righteous onslaught, they meet their inevitable end, light years away on Tarvan, sacrificed as a martyr to the cause. Every day, the endless winds of the moon carry an echoing cacophony of muffled screams as those sacrificed are cast from atop cliff's edge. As they fall to their doom, the assembled Covenant devotees chant and sing songs of prayer that this sacrifice may prove acceptable, and that the wretched soul finds a semblance of peace in the moments before they succumb to the cleansing power of immolating fire. The Great Plains of Ariela, with their violet and indigo grassland plateaus and crisp, cool air, provides an ideal landscape for the raising of cattle. Early settlers, including those from the original scattering, as well as subsequent waves of colonization, were attracted to the planet by its comparatively comfortable agrarian lifestyle and wide open spaces. Soon, grand herds of cattle, mostly Terran buffalo, grazed the land, tended to by generations of families living alone in isolated homesteads, away from the few major towns, out on the open range. For many years, attempts to advance the planet's economic development were hampered by minuscule electrical interferences, static and short-circuiting of otherwise standard diaspora technologies. No cause was ever found, and soon, these early attempts at industrialization were abandoned. Yet, this electromagnetic phenomenon proved only a mild inconvenience for early settlers of Ariela, to whom the lack of a planet-side techno-industrial economy proved something of a boon to their chosen agrarian lifestyle. Yet, as the years turned to decades, the natural rhythms of the planet became more apparent, and it was noted that the electrical interference would grow and crest in strength and intensity before calming once more. At its peak, even the otherwise indestructible multi-purpose utility units, or MPU-2s, upon which every colony depends, would begin to malfunction, inflicting power and water shortages upon the weary citizens. Such shortages and brownouts, however, proved only a distraction from the true threat to the people of Ariela, the Mist Spectres. For at the peak of the planet's electromagnetic cycle every 8 years, the evening and early morning mists, so ubiquitous across the elevated plateaus and mountain paths of the planet, seemed to come alive. Those who witness the rolling of evening and early morning mists swear they can see figures, silhouettes gliding within the shrouding fog, appearing momentarily before dissipating back into nothing. Shapeless and formless, the movements of these specters seem random at first, gliding wherever the mists may take them. Yet, upon contact with a building like a homestead, the presence of this unnatural structure seems to enrage the very mist itself. The air in the homestead begins to crackle with unseen energies, generating sweet-smelling ozone and causing the hair on one's head to stand on its ends, as if in anticipation. Electrical wiring sizzles and sparks from the electromagnetic onslaught, while doors and windows of the abode begin to buckle and crack under some unseen external pressure. For those who securely seconded themselves indoors, the slow, grinding assault of the mist can be weathered, endured with steadfast resolve in the cold darkness of the long night. Here, the children are taught to hum to themselves, to drown out the almost imperceptibly quiet and wordless whispers from outside to their sweet death. And for those who relent to the siren's call, or worse still, are caught out in the open as night falls, their ultimate fate remains unknown. For initial yelps of fear and discomfort quickly give way to screams of terror and torture before fading within moments into agonizing silence. Desperate searches are commonly mounted come morning, family and friends trying in vain to rescue or at least recover the body of their fallen brethren. But the bodies are never found, the mist specters leaving no trace of their victims, as if erasing them from existence. Legend now says that if one evening you are to catch a glimpse out of the corner of your eye of a face staring at you through the window, that is the face of a specter come to mark your homestead. And that if you do not leave, the specters will soon come for you, as relentless and unstoppable as the mist itself, to inflict upon you agony, torment, and death. when the local hermit, Jeremiah, appeared outside the walls of the settlement years after his self-imposed exile. He brought with him a message of hope. For too long had the people of the cavernous gray moonlet of Egolia suffered from the constant threat of the Arania, brown, dog-sized spider monstrosities with a cruel penchant for attacking settlers in swarms and feasting upon their paralyzed yet still living bodies. When Jeremiah returned claiming prophetic visions and ancient powers, there were many who rejected his fanciful declaration. Yet, when he demonstrated his abilities, causing an attacking swarm to flee with his mere presence, this apparent miracle all but guaranteed his elevation. Soon, the local executive officer was overthrown by an angry mob, fueled by equal parts fear and hope. And from the ashes of the former regime rose Jeremiah, declared High Lord of Egolia by acclamation, heralding a period of hope and salvation. The prophet initially proved good to his word, with his elaborate druidic spells, complete with crude tapestries of woven local fibers, seemingly empowering the city walls themselves with the magics to repel the blighted monstrosities. His success saw Jeremiah take on an almost messianic persona, and soon his very presence was met with adoration and devotion. A cult quickly coalesced around the High Lord, celebrating his triumphs, preaching his truth, and praising his divinity. Jeremiah's early reign was not without its excesses, with the wives and daughters of many settlers forming something of a debauched harem, while a sizable share of the colony's meager resources were siphoned away to maintain the prophet's comfort. Most turned a blind eye to this lust and gluttony, however, overcome by zealotry and faithfulness. So absolute was the devotion of the people to Jeremiah that when a small Red Order fleet made landfall on the moonlet to suppress this burgeoning local faith, the novices and deacons of the Tarvan Covenant were met in battle with a righteous fury that even they could not match. The slaughter that ensued was a bloody victory, yet it was not without its impact, and soon Jeremiah's once compassionate homilies were replaced by unhinged and vitriolic rants against the unseen threats and enemies. Well-meaning questions on how Jeremiah prevented the scourge from approaching the city walls, once deftly parried by the prophet, were now met with suspicion, enmity, and even claims of treason and heresy. Soon the authority of the prophet began to unravel. Heavy-handed actions to suppress growing discontent simply fueled more bitterness and anger, just as assaults against devotees reaffirmed the prophet's growing oppression. And so, it proved inevitable that a particularly cruel execution of an innocent young woman, meant to strike fear in the hearts of a rebellious people, instead triggered a bloody, violent, and destructive riot. Brutalized, starving, and angry people raged through the streets that night, hunting down and ripping apart every devotee they could find. Buildings were ransacked and destroyed. Fires lit and blood stained the streets as the mob quickly converged on the comparatively outlandish abode of the prophet. Cornering the prophet, any fears of his divinity and supernatural powers were blinded by the pure fury of the crowd, and the once savior was soon dragged onto the street where he was stabbed, disemboweled, quartered, and his remains were set alight. As morning broke, the crackling fires of broken buildings still smoldering were the only sounds that disturbed the eerie silence. The orgy of violence and bloodlust that had ushered the fall of the false prophet was spent, and the residents wandered aimlessly in the streets in shock and quiet reverie. Yet, the silence was soon broken by the sound of skittering. The initial distant echo gave way to a thunderous stampede as thousands of Arania emerged from the caves and rolled over the burnt and broken city walls, and into the streets like a wave of legs and fangs. For days following the attack, the sounds of screams and torturous pain filled the ruins of the settlement, as the surviving residents were consumed alive. None would ever understand their folly, for none knew the secret that Jeremiah had discovered within the caves. For as the Arania feasted on human flesh, the charred and scorched tapestries that adorned the city walls, the very ones placed by Jeremiah during his spell-casting facade, waved gently in the breeze. Here, flame having utterly destroyed the rare cave-dwelling root fibers of the weaves, and with them, their formidable, repelling qualities. Edgar had found it. It was after years of countless sleepless nights, obsessively poring over comms data, planetary scans, geomagnetic surveys, and even first-hand accounts from prospectors, that he had found the mistake. It seemed that despite the reports to the contrary, the planet of Cancri in the Eurogantis expanse was not the worthless rock that many claimed. So, when a new settlement initiative was launched, partially subsidized by the Galador hegemony, Edgar eagerly signed up. He was obsessed with uncovering this mystery, not only for the potential windfall, but to answer the question that had nagged him ever since he had overheard a brief discussion in a bar months earlier. With newly acquired fog implants and a one-way ticket, Edgar left his job as a pod mechanic on Galador and cast himself into the void. During pre-launch, Edgar had kept to himself, generally ignoring or rebuffing the friendly advances of his fellow settlers, much to their chagrin. In any other situation, such antisocial attitudes might have been a problem, but for Edgar, his priorities lay elsewhere. Despite all he had copiously absorbed about the planet for many years, Cancri was far more unpleasant than his worst expectations. The dimly lit planet of emerald greens and sandy hues was bitterly cold, reaching only marginally above freezing in equatorial zones. And its partially breathable atmosphere required the constant use of respirators when not inside prefabricated habitats or pressurized tunnels. But Edgar knew in the depths of his very soul that the riches lay in the steep snow-covered hills and Rocky Mountain valleys of the world, and he would stop at nothing to find them. So, mere moments after taking his first step on this new world, Edgar had collected what meager supplies he had purchased and headed straight into the wilds, all but abandoning his fellow settlers. His days were spent trekking across rough, rocky terrain, his nights in a basic envirocapsule with no heat. His only respite was being able to remove his respirator and breathe clean air, if only for a few hours as he slept. He ate nothing but artificial protein strips and carbohydrate bars, and drank melted snow. He cared not for luxuries like real food. He was on a mission. Fortunately, he did not have far to travel. It was midday on the third day when he found it, an unpowered relay station and beacon at a previous mineral test site. This was it, the location in the scan data that pointed to signs of rare earths, namely deposits of the prized rare earth mineral of gadolinium, essential for anti-grav drive casings in all pods and chartercraft in the diaspora. He quickly reactivated the relay station and reviewed the log. With growing anticipation, he perused the now complete and unabridged data before his eyes. And there it was, the mistake, a simple data entry error by one of the initial prospectors that resulted in the abundant deposit of the rare earth just below his feet, going unnoticed and unclaimed. No longer. It had been 3 years since that fateful day, and the colonists all gazed into the midday sky with hopeful anticipation. Edgar, now elected executive officer of the settlement, busied himself with the matters of governance. Yet nothing proved sufficiently urgent or engrossing to distract him from the hope, fear, anticipation, and dread of the merchant's return. For it was not the first time they had sought to test the markets on Galador with their rare earth production. The previous captain, a free flagger, had disappeared a year earlier, shortly after leaving the system, and with him, a partially filled hold of unrefined gadolinium. Yet, there was cause for greater hope this time, with the CSS Argyle informing the settlement of their return to Cancree and their impending arrival. It was only a matter of hours before the townsfolk of the hamlet, now colloquially called Gadolin, cheered through their respirators as the silver and black of the winged starcraft broke through the atmosphere and made landfall near the township. As the townsfolk rushed forward, Edgar stayed back and simply admired the boon of their first successful trade as it was unloaded from the cavernous hold of the Argyle. Medical supplies, food, machinery, tools, seeds, and greenhouse equipment, and even prefabricated lodgings were soon laid before all to see, a bounty of plenty and of potential. Edgar smiled to himself at the excitement, the hope, the joy on the partially covered faces of the townsfolk. They had been wary of his entreaties upon his return, back in those early days of the settlement. His determination-fueled aloofness had given way to an earnest plea for support for this venture when he had returned with news of his discovery. Despite some initial hesitation, the townsfolk had accepted him, supported him, elevated him. And now, so many cold nights later, the gambit had paid off, not just for him, but for all of Gadolin. This feast day, it was an insult. It had been decades since Garen had partaken in a genuine celebration, the very concept of a feast day seeming anachronistic in the giant lava worm-plagued, smog-filled warren cities of Lossarion. For as long as anyone could remember, the harsh world of fiery brimstone and choking noxious fumes had been home to the primary terrestrial industrial base of the wider Tyson Sector Compact. The world offered little respite or comforts to its human residents, yet thousands arrived daily in the hope of finding the one thing it had to offer: jobs. Garen wiped his brow. Grime, oil, and sweat mixed to coat his skin. Scratches and cuts from endless hours of grinding labor stung from the residue, his eyes burning from the exhaust. Only a makeshift cloth mask prevented him from directly inhaling the noxious fumes. If these were the jobs the migrants of 100 worlds craved, they could have them. Yet, war was upon the Compact once again, and the parts and equipment produced by Lossarion were critical to the war effort. He was told to do his part for the Compact, but he cared not for the wider galaxy. Garen needed the money, and more importantly, the ration credits, to feed his family. He only qualified for enough rations credits to barely sustain 2 grown adults, and the meager pay all went to lodgings and utilities. Garen had become very adept at going extended periods without food. His record was 6 days. It wasn't a pleasant record. The horn bellowed, loud and boisterous to be heard over the clanging and scraping of the factory. Exhausted, Garen wanted nothing more than but to make his way home to his tiny cube home. As he crawled along the oil-slick streets of the transit tunnel in the back of the open-top shuttle bus, Garen caught glimpses of shops. Weathered and worn, the shops, nonetheless, tried valiantly to attract customers with decorations of the festive season. For even in the harshness of Lossarion warrens, The outward trappings feast of Blessed Nicholas were displayed. The deacons and novices of the Tarvan Covenant seem ever present at this time of year, leading prayers and heralding tales of hope, sacrifice, and repentance. Garen cared not for their tales, for he knew their corruption, their sinister intentions. For every good novice, there were 100 who proved themselves devout in name only, willing to wield their power for their own personal gain. For the last month, a particularly unsavory older novice had preyed on Garen and his family, calling upon Garen's young wife when he was at work and when their kids were at school, and forcing her to succumb to his unwanted advances. Upon hearing of this invasion, this assault, Garen seethed with impotent fury, his wife begging him not to escalate things for fear of the inevitable retribution. Yet, despite his wife's entreaties, his fury did not dissipate, and instead clung to his very soul like a hot black tar, burning away at him. Garen's dwelling was a simple cube house, stacked up 7 high, along with thousands of others that lined the walls of the residential warren. Simple anti-grav lifts were originally installed to provide people ease of access to high abodes, but those had long since fallen into disrepair. So, he dragged his haggard body up 7 flights of metal stairs, located on the outside of his home stack. As he slogged his way upwards, motivated only by his impending reunion with those he loved, he noticed a figure on the stairs above him. As he climbed up a flight before doubling back to continue upwards, he caught another glimpse. The figure was wearing a gray robe, hooded and long. It was the novice. Garen continued to walk up the stairs without missing a step as the novice turned to walk down beside him. Garen's mind raced as the novice approached, his eyes fixed to the steps before him. As they passed each other, though, Garen could not help but glance up at the novice's face, only to catch the older man glancing back at him, a sly grin on his face. "Your wife is quite the feast day host," the novice jibed as they passed. The deep well of burning fury with Garen began to bubble over at the quip, the voice of his wife telling him to leave it be, to not react, drowned out by a hot, white rage. The novice scoffed at Garen's apparent unresponsiveness and continued on. Yet, as the religious man reached the landing at the bottom of the stairs, he felt a sharp tug on his robes. Spun around at considerable speed, the novice was brought face to face with Garen, the worker's eyes now filled with a tearful anger. The novice seemed shocked for a moment at being accosted, but soon, upon looking into Garen's green eyes, he felt a moment of panic. With a single big push, Garen sent the novice over the rail of the landing. Gasping in shock, the novice barely managed to let out a scream before he landed head first on the rough pavement below. Garen did not wait to see the body land. Within moments, he was at his door, and there he saw his young wife, her clothes disheveled, and her expression one of knowing embarrassment. But as she looked over at her husband, she saw his face beaming with a smile, and she could not help but meet his with her own. As he hugged his wife, tears now streaming down his grime-covered face, he finally felt his rage, his fury, his hopelessness melt away. It felt good to do something, and a considerable weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Perhaps this feast day wasn't so bad after all. Marisa warmed her hands to the fire of her homestead's central hearth. The planet vicinity was about to enter the deep winter, where its elliptical orbit pushed the planet's already snow-blasted, Arctic-style climate to the brink of being utterly uninhabitable. Yet, Marisa was not concerned, for her homestead was sturdy and her ranch well-placed to weather the long, dark, cold months. The subterranean stores of the ranch were overflowing with frozen Vendeer steaks and the carbo-rich tubers harvested during the brief spring thaw. Firewood supplies were ample, and the precious herd was protected from the elements with a warm and sturdy barn. All of this was thanks to the hard work and arduous toil of Marisa's 3 husbands. Marisa stood up from the chair with much effort. Her belly grew fuller and rounder by the day. She had been eager to start a family, knowing that it was her duty, as the matriarch of the ranch, to bear forth future generations. She hoped for a girl, prayed for it in fact, to the druidic gods made manifest in the towering trees and wild beasts of vicinity. It was, however, highly unlikely. For whatever reason, ancient chaos magics held sway over the world of vicinity and had decreed that female children were to be a rare blessing. Only 1 in 5 children born on vicinity were female. For any society, this would have represented an existential threat. Yet, perhaps the ancient gods of the frozen tundra and jagged icy cliffs had foreseen the catastrophic fate that many of the settlers would ultimately face. For the task of taming the world was so dangerous that only half of males born ever lived to see 20, and less than a quarter reached the ripe old age of 50. As Marisa moved over to the frosted glass window of her kitchen, she surveyed the frenzy of activity in the main yard of the ranch. Here she witnessed her 3 husbands working in concert, making last-minute repairs and securing critical supplies during the increasingly short vicinity days. She rested her hand on her swollen stomach and smiled. Her husbands were good men. They toiled for her and for each other to build a life in the icy wastes of vicinity, and she was determined to give each of them a real family. Her first husband, Ronan, was the closest thing she had to a true love. He was a tall man, muscular and hardy, born from a healthy bloodline back in the town of Ridgeway. While vicinity cared not for romance and love, such feelings being superfluous to the grand challenge of survival, Marisa found her heart flutter by his broad shoulders, kind eyes, and cheeky humor. So it took little convincing and minimal dowry from Ronan's mother for Marisa to take him as her first husband. With a duly issued writ of occupancy from the matriarchs of the Regional Co-op Council and subsidized building supplies, Marisa and Ronan cast themselves into the wilds, hand in hand, in search of a new home. That initial year was the most grueling, particularly in the first deep winter. With only makeshift shelter, Marisa and Ronan put their very lives on the line for the hope of a better tomorrow. And resolute determination and each other's love saw the young couple weather the biting squalls and swirling snowstorms, and eventually raise their ranch homestead. With a real home established, their odds of survival became marginally better. And this encouraged Marisa to add her second husband to the group, Matthias. The youngest son of a nearby ranch mother, he was quick-witted, fair of face, scrappy, and hard-working, and he and Ronan soon struck up something of a friendship. When Marisa asked him to marry her, Matthias readily accepted, overwhelmed with relief that the deadly fate that befell most young male children, that of isolation, would not come to pass for him. And Matthias quickly proved himself an asset to the ranch. Soon, wild herds of Vendeer were wrangled and penned, while lumbering Rorschach beasts were tamed and put to work, plowing the frozen dirt and helped expand the homestead further. Then there was Marisa's third husband. It was almost a year to the day when Jackson had collapsed on the edge of death at the door of the homestead. Lost in the wilds during a hunt gone awry, his Rorschach beast led him far astray in the ensuing blizzard. Feeling as though his presence had been ordained by fateful spirits, Marisa welcomed the young man into her home and later into her bed, and the ranch was suddenly home to 4. And very soon, it would be 5. As she felt her unborn child kick against her resting hands, she smiled to herself. She honestly didn't know which of her husbands was the biological father. It could have been any of them, and a part of her preferred it that way. For as she looked out at the 3 men in her lives, Marisa's heart was filled with contentment. In a very real way, all 3 would be the child's father, caring for the infant and vesting it to all their love and hope for the future. And no matter what the child proved to be, girl or boy, Marisa knew it would be blessed to have 3 of the best fathers for which anyone could hope. No matter how many times the colonel jumped, the result was the same. Dizziness, nausea, and headaches, akin to a groggy hangover. The fog was horrid stuff, but the mind-numbing cocktail of drugs was always better than the malady. The dimly lit bridge of the CMS Ethereal light hummed into life, a cacophony of electronic beeps from reinitializing systems, blending melodically with an undertone of complaining groans from the bridge crew. The colonel rubbed his stubbed face with his techno-augmented hands as holographic displays materialized before him. He nonchalantly scanned real-time feeds of the ships gathered with him. The dull, dark gray shadows were almost imperceptible against the black of space. They were running quiet, not 100% silent, but hopefully enough to maintain the element of surprise. Casually flicking his fingers at the holographic interface, he retrieved the outputs of the compact's long-range stealth probes. This star system was far from the most hospitable in the diaspora, the young star's radiant output having long ago robbed the inner planets of their precarious surface water. Yet, within this system, hung the yellow and orange jewel of the Anoran Confederacy, and arguably the most successful colony of the diaspora, the desert world of Janfar. The intelligence from the probes corroborated his mission packet. The Janfarian Rapid Response Fleet had been successfully lured out of system by an earlier assault. The only resistance expected was from a local picket detachment, nothing the colonel's strike group couldn't handle. As the flotilla of motley privateers assumed their attack formation, the grizzled warrior signaled for the fleet to jump at sublight speeds to a Confederate ice mining operation in orbit of the gas giant, Lysantis. While Janfar itself was all but impervious to direct assault, the Confederacy were just as vulnerable as anyone to hit and run attacks on their more isolated mining operations and supply lines. The ensuing assault was as swift as it was decisive. Unleashing their ordnance immediately upon returning to nominal space, swarms of intelligent combat drones, or ICDs, executed their pre-assigned missions. The tactic was called drone dumping, and it had been a highly successful first strike military stratagem for much of the past 3 centuries. Extraction skiffs, ice pod depots, and orbital launch facilities were the primary focus. The drones evading point defense systems before sacrificing themselves to unleash their flechette-style payloads at relativistic speeds. Blinding points of primal light flickered across the colonel's holodisplay as hundreds of impacts all but disintegrated their targets. And just as rapidly as they had arrived, the colonel issued the order for the mercenary flotilla to withdraw. As they jumped, all that was left of the ice mining operation was molten scrap and charred remains. The ever-expanding debris cloud already captured by the impressive gravity well of the gas giant. Returning to the comparative safety of near FTL speeds, the colonel sank back into his chair and let out the long breath he had been holding for the entirety of the engagement. He smiled at his good fortune, Compact intelligence had proven reasonably accurate. All targets were accounted for and destroyed. And resistance had been unexpectedly light, with the Janfarian picket detachment nowhere to be seen. He listened in on the comms chatter of his flotilla, chuckling at the revelry of the mercenary crews. Every mission was tense, but the completeness of this victory, after a lifetime of close calls and near misses, was refreshing. Yet, as they approached their staging point once again, the colonel felt a sudden wave of unease roll over him. Something was wrong. His instincts had never lied to him. He frantically surveyed his holo display for any anomalies. Yet, whether it was his growing age or the after effects of the fog, he was unable to identify the source of his growing trepidation before his frigate was struck. His body lurched forward in his chair, saved only by the restrictive flight harness. He didn't need sensors to tell him that the ethereal light had been hit, a space mine from the feel of the concussive impact. Then came the barrage of direct energy and projectile fire, his ship's armor rapidly ablating under the onslaught. It would seem the flotilla's arrival in system had not gone unnoticed as hoped, with the Janfarian picket choosing to sacrifice the ice mining operation to lay a trap for the mercenaries upon their withdrawal. It was a devious gambit, of which the colonel begrudgingly approved. The frigate's main AI instantly assumed control and executed full evasive maneuvers while returning fire. The dampening field from the anti-grav drive that typically buffeted the crew from the worst effects of high-G maneuvers was insufficient to prevent darkness quickly closing in around the colonel's vision. He struggled to maintain his consciousness, locking his mind in on the comms traffic from his flotilla, where moments earlier he heard laughing and chatter. Now there was only violent and chaotic screams, punctuated by sudden deathly silence. Within less than a minute, his flotilla was all but destroyed. He snarled to himself, sparks and fire illuminating the bloody corpses of his bridge crew as the AI continued its desperate yet ultimately futile evasion. The frigate was the last ship to fall, an accelerated particle weapon piercing the anti-grav engine manifold and triggering a catastrophic meltdown. In those final moments, the colonel's life did not flash before his eyes. He felt no regrets, no remorse, no sorrow. One moment, he was on the bridge of his frigate, his pride and joy, desperately seeking to remain conscious. The next, without time for pain or fear, he was gone. If there is one world in the diaspora that could justly assume the mantle of being a second Earth, it is Somayaji. It is said that to gaze upon the verdant greens and cerulean blues of Somayaji is to hearken back to a time before the Madagascar impact or the War of Cataclysm, to when the Earth had not been despoiled by the follies of man. For many would-be colonists, the allure of the vast oceans, jungle-covered lands, and towering mountain peaks of Somayaji is absolute, calling out to them across the galaxy like a divine herald. For centuries, many tried in desperation to settle the planet, to call it their home. No planet in the diaspora has been subject to more colonization attempts over the centuries. Almost all failed. For the world of Somayaji is violently protective of its burgeoning biosphere, as if humanity's reputation as ravagers and plunderers have preceded us. Death awaits the foolish and unprepared, for there seems little in the diaspora more delectable, more enticing to the wildlife of the planet than that of human flesh. Yet, some of the brave and foolhardy pioneers who cast themselves out into the world survived, and from their footholds, spread across the planet's various biomes, societies grew and prospered beneath blue skies, unlike anywhere else in the diaspora. For the world of Somayaji is a stunning contrast of land and sea, dominated by a single primordial supercontinent named Caldora. every inch of land has seemingly been claimed by thick and untamed jungle. The enveloping canopy is so thick that the star's radiant brilliance is all but extinguished in the undergrowth below, dancing shadows offering monstrous insectoid beasts ample cover to stalk their prey. The few oases of unvegetated land that do exist are perched atop the tallest mountains of the Razorback Range. This extensive string of long dormant volcanoes is punctuated by towering peaks, their steep inclines rising well above the tree line to touch the very heavens themselves. And surrounding the vast jungle continent is the Eversea, a global ocean of such expanse that only the water world of Ozovan can match its breadth. Dotted with a handful of small island archipelagos, the ocean teems with aquatic life, equally enthusiastic with the prospect of dining on wayward castaways. Despite the hardships and challenges of the world, those who succeeded in settling the planet have been rewarded for their perseverance, their gumption, and their resilience 1,000-fold. The mineral wealth of the mountains and the natural bounty of the seas and jungles have supported a vibrant economy, catapulting the planet to the forefront of interstellar trade and diplomacy. And for the three distinct peoples that have made the planet their home, those of the mountains, the jungles, and the seas, each are instinctually aware in their very souls that their survival and prosperity lies in mutual cooperation. For every child of Somayaji knows the tale of the lone tree. Tallest and mightiest, the tree decides in its foolhardy arrogance to separate from the smaller trees of the jungle to better display its grandeur atop a nearby mountain. Yet, the tree soon experiences difficulty finding purchase in soft alluvial soils of the mountain top without the buttressing root network of the smaller trees it left behind. So, when battered by one of the megastorms that regularly assault the jungle with their blasting winds and torrential rains, it is not the lone tree, with its great height and impressive strength, that survives. Instead, it is the clutch of smaller trees, once ridiculed and chastised by the lone tree, that weather the storm, their roots intertwining in steadfast support, comfort, and aid of each other, to live on for another day. His foot slipped, his shin striking the blunt rock of the rough stone steps. He instinctually reached out his hands to secure himself against the mountainside as he let out a yelp of pain. That was close. Too close. Musa steadied himself and took a deep breath. Every part of his body ached, not just from the scratches and bumps of the rugged terrain, but from his heavy pack. He struggled to understand why anyone would choose bleak and lifeless rock over the verdant lushness and abundance of his jungle home. But he soon would. For it was custom on Somayaji for those reaching the age of 18 to spend time immersed among the other peoples of the world. Musa was one of the Ngali, the dark-skinned tribes of the jungle biomes of Caldora supercontinent that could trace their heritage back to that of Nigeria and West Africa on Lost Earth. The Ngali had expertly adapted to the terrors of the dark and swamp-like jungle undergrowth by constantly being on the move. Their caravans of tamed beasts and anti-grav vehicles crisscrossed the Caldor to trade the jungle's bounty with the peoples of the mountains and of the sea. As he continued his climb, Musa could see his destination above him. The people of the mountains, the Ritish clans, had long ago settled the peaks of the Razorback Range. There, they constructed spire-like cities of stone and glass in the few plateaus and mountain tops that rose above the pervasive jungle. Cities such as the Crystal Haven. The Ritish were very different from the Ngali, shorter, fair of skin and features. Yet Musa, like all Ngali, held the Ritish in great esteem. For early in Somayaji's settlement during the scattering, the peoples of the jungles, the mountains, and seas had each come to realize that their survival depended greatly on each other. and the climb was now one of a number of rituals and traditions across the planet that helped to foster lasting and steadfast bonds of fraternity between the three societies. As Musa neared the top of the mountain, his silent solitude of the past week was disturbed by the distant cheering of onlookers above. There ahead of him, he could see the Gate of Embrace, a grand archway in the intricately carved stone and iron wall that ringed the base of the Crystal Haven. He had little time to appreciate his first impressions of the towering glass spires or the dense maze-like streets of the city before being rushed by the gathered crowd. Smiling faces and calls of welcome and congratulations beckoned him through the Gate of Embrace and into their city. He was overwhelmed by the welcome, throwing his hands into the air in triumph and relief, much to the enjoyment of the jubilant crowd. The crowd, however, soon parted, as a young couple, both fair of skin and blonde of hair, raced towards him. Musa recognized them instantly. It was Eliza and Marshall. Musa had spoken by holocron to both of them many times in the past months since learning she would be his host during his time in the Crystal Haven, and they had quickly forged a deep and intimate connection. He dropped his pack to the ground and ran to meet the couple. First, it was the young woman, taking her into his arms and lifting her diminutive and nubile form in their first embrace. Then, the husband. They greeted each other with a warm handshake and a slap on the shoulder, as if brothers being reunited. The joyous meeting drew a raucous and appreciative cheer from the gathered crowd. Musa, exhausted from his great feat of strength and endurance, was overwhelmed with joy at finally meeting the young couple, his new friends and now companions for the next year. After his arduous journey, he had arrived somewhere very different. Yet, already, it felt like he belonged. And as the couple led him, arm in arm, in the direction of their home, Musa's mind was filled with anticipation of the countless memories the three of them would create together. Memories that would last a lifetime.
Lady Alana, princess consort of the House of Callum, awoke. A sudden blast of heat across her skin shocked her from the stupor. She was alive, somehow. Moments earlier, the royal skyship Ariela had entered a death spiral, with both the aft and starboard manifolds failing. Anti-grav drives were as close to infallible as you could find in the diaspora. The probability of one, let alone both, failing was astronomically small. It had to be sabotage, she had thought to herself. Alana slowly opened her eyes, her head groggy from a G-force-induced bout of unconsciousness. The scene before her was horrific. The Ariela's fuselage was shattered into thousands of charred and twisted pieces, strewn across the now blackened terrain of the jungle's swamp-like undergrowth. Then she noticed the bodies. Mutilated corpses, most barely recognizable as human, were scattered everywhere. The full complement of the ship's crew seemingly lost in the cataclysmic violence of the crash. Lady Alana felt a wave of nausea roll over her. She reached down and unbuckled the flight harness that had undoubtedly saved her, and collapsed to the blood-stained ground before her, vomiting. Yet she had no time to rest. She immediately glanced up, startled and afraid, as three haggard survivors frantically ran towards her, terror plastered across their faces. It was then that the immediacy of the danger dawned on her. For the Ariela had gone down deep in the jungles of Caldora, easily one of the most dangerous places on the planet, if not the wider diaspora. And they were being hunted. As the men approached, Alana saw one suddenly collapse to the ground, tripped from behind. Grasping at his leg, he turned to the other men, and then onto Alana, screaming with fear and desperation as he was dragged away. A tendril vine, the carnivorous and semi-mobile plant, had grappled his leg, and within moments, lifted him into the air before dropping him into its waiting, acid-filled maw. A gurgled scream from the man heralded his gruesome demise. Fear and shock swept over Alana as more and more vines snaked across the crash site and towards the survivors. so she ran. She hurtled past flaming wreckage and mutilated corpses, dodging several accosting vines desperate to subdue and consume her. She managed to clear the wreckage, hiding behind a large rocky outcropping with the other survivors. That was when she heard the dull roaring thunder of the stampede. Within seconds of finding refuge from the vines, the jungle burst forth with a swarm of hundreds of insectoid monstrosities. They were all manner of horrific creatures, dog-sized grubs that left an acidic slime in their wake, skittering, spiny human-sized insectoids with razor-sharp appendages to skew their prey, giant dragonflies flittering in the sky, eager to hurl down their tail-mounted spines. And of course, there were the behemoths, giant four-legged, four-armed insects juggernauts the size of vehicles, while crushing mandibles and thick-scaled hides. Alana watched in horror as the stampeding swarm rolled over the crash like a wave. Every scrap of organic matter, from scattered foodstuffs, charred linens, and mangled corpses, were eagerly consumed by the insects. And then they turned their attention towards Alana. She had nowhere to run, surrounded on all sides by dense jungle, by danger. But fear and instinct carried her forward once again, through the rough, swampy terrain and away from the approaching swarm. Yet the creatures, born of the jungle and of the world, were too fast, and within moments, the first wave reached her. The princess braced herself for the attack, for her horrifically violent end. Then, a crashing boom echoed through the swampy undergrowth, and she was knocked to the ground from the forceful shockwave. That wasn't the bugs, she thought, as her head wrung from the concussive force. She peered up from her prone position as giant human-mounted lizard beasts and anti-grav vehicles emerged from the jungle's edge before her and rapidly engaged the swarm. All manner of weapons unloaded their ordnance, with cataclysmic explosions tearing the swarm apart in an orgy of delightfully gratuitous violence. As the beasts and vehicles surround the crash site, Alana turned back to the jungle from whence they came. Still lying on the ground, her regal garments torn, blood-soaked, and covered with grime, she saw a man approaching her. Dark-skinned, tall with broad shoulders, the bright light of the sun perfectly framed the man's handsome face with an angelic halo. As he looked down on her, he smiled and spoke. And with that, Alana heard the foremost wondrous and joyous words of her life. 4 words that not only represented her salvation, but also her future. Welcome to the caravan.